All right, so just to reiterate, this session is being recorded and the recording will be posted both on our YouTube page and just on our Facebook. The link will be posted on our Facebook, so no need to worry about that. So my name is Erica Eisen. I'm the coordinator of the Writing and Academic Resource Center, or WARC, or VAC. With me is my colleague, Maria Antonova, who is the director of the WARC, and we are here to talk about the structure of a senior thesis. So we will be going through the purpose of the different chapters, what they do, looking at some questions that you can ask yourself in order to structure the writing process, and hopefully clearing up, what the purpose of each part of the thesis is. So I have a PowerPoint presentation. Let me just start screen sharing. So one moment. All right. So do you guys, Maria, can you confirm that you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned, today's presentation is called The Structure of a Senior Thesis. But before, excuse me, before you begin, I think it's very important that you check for yourself if you have a good, solid research question. If you're not sure what a research question is, or you're not sure what your research question is, or you think you know what your research question is, but you're not sure if it's a good one, we recommend that you take a look at the lecture that we posted. And I'm also going to ask people just joining us to please mute their microphones. So we would ask that you take a look at a video that we did on research proposals, because at the beginning of that video, we have a quite detailed discussion of what a research proposal is and what makes a good one. So we posted our YouTube channel link in the chat. You can find a recording of that talk at that link. All right, so let's say you have a good research question. That's great. Let's move on to the general structure of the rest of the thesis. So, surprise, surprise, the first part is the introduction, where you discuss what you're going to be researching, you introduce that topic, and you establish why it's important, right? The next section is the literature review. So I think some of you will have already had to write this for your research seminars, but the purpose of a literature review is to establish what other scholars have had to say about this topic, right? And how your research builds on that, fits into that. Next, if you're doing social science or hard science research, you'll have a methodology section where you discuss how you're going to gather your results. So there's going to be a survey, what exactly you're going to be doing. Then you'll discuss the results, what did you find? Have a discussion section where you interpret the results, what do these findings mean? And then a conclusion where you wrap up and usually talk about the broader implications of your research. Okay, so as well as going through the steps, I thought it might be useful to look at an example of a real student's senior thesis and how they accomplished each of these things. So the thesis that I found online, I think just by Googling student senior thesis, is called Parting the Green Curtain, Tracing Environmental Inequality in Portland, Oregon. So this is a thesis that is looking at the history of social inequality and environmental problems, in the city of Portland, Oregon, where the student lives. Okay. So as I mentioned before, and as is probably pretty intuitive, the first part is the introduction. So some of the questions that you can ask to help structure your introduction or get yourself thinking for the writing process are things like, what is the focus of your research? Why is it important? Establish the stakes, the reason why, it's important that this question be researched. What is or are your research questions, as we discussed earlier? And what, very briefly, is your research design? Obviously, you'll discuss that further on later. So I also wanted to provide some phrases or, sentence patterns that you can use to help make sure that your writing is academic in its tone. So for this section, will be something like, this study will examine something. The goal or objective of this project is to something. This project seeks or aims to something. And I hope to shed light on or show something. All right. So let's return to the student thesis that I mentioned earlier and look at how they introduced their topic. Okay, so this thesis utilizes a lens of environmental justice to analyze the history of Portland, Oregon, in the formation of the Albina neighborhood in North Portland to understand how this community became a space of environmental inequality. So here, from one sentence, you sort of have a clear summary of the goals of this project and sort of the research question. How did this community become a space of environmental inequality, environmental injustice, right? So you can tell that it's, probably a history student, and very clear what you're going to be reading from the start. And then the next sentence, let's look at that. Portland has been a leader in sustainable development, and yet, even with its successes, the city, so this is a typo, has either been unable or unwilling to address the disproportionate impacts of environmental hazards, another typo, on low income and communities of color in Albina, right? So in this sentence, what the student is doing is establishing the stakes, right? A lot of people see Portland as a great example of environmental policy, but there's one area where that's that reputation is really not earned, right? And they want to investigate that. So I think this is a good example of how in a couple of sentences you can establish what the thesis is going to be about and why it's important. Okay, so here's a grammar point that I wanted to include here just because it seems like it's a big problem for a lot of non-native English speakers. So indirect questions. So if you notice from the first sentence here, this thesis is trying to understand how this community became a space of environmental inequality. This is an indirect question. So direct questions are actual questions, right? In English, they use a special kind of weird word order, usually. So an example is, what time is it? What is your name? Or, for research, why does this happen, this effect something? How does pollution affect mental health? And is this method effective? Research method, for example. So if you might notice here, and I'm sure you've heard your English teachers say, you begin either with the question word in the case of why and how questions here, and then helping verb, does, or when you don't have one of these question words, you begin with the verb is, and then you have the subject, this method, right? So that's sort of a weird word order, but that's usually how we ask questions in English, direct questions. However, indirect questions are statements related to questions. So the student asked me what time it was, or someone asked me what my name was, right? Something like that. In English, they use our regular word order, just like a normal statement. So sometimes it seems like students, when they're putting indirect questions in their writing, they use the word order of direct questions. So this is an important grammar point because oftentimes when you're explaining what your research is about, you're going to use an indirect question. So here are some examples that you might see in imaginary thesis. Many scholars have tried to explain why this happens, right? So we have the question word, and then instead of the verb, we have the subject, and then the verb, right? Or this paper will examine how pollution affects mental health, right? Question word, subject, verb. Just like, a regular English sentence for your subject verb. And then lastly, scientists do not know if, or whether, you could also say, this method is effective. So sometimes I see in student writing something like, scientists do not know, is this method effective? Something like that. So just as you're writing, this might be a grammar point to keep in mind or to review if you're having difficulty. All right, so moving on to the next sort of chapter that we're going to talk about today, the literature review. So I think some of you will have already written a literature review for your thesis or a draft, but just to go over it once again, maybe it will be helpful as you edit. So some questions to keep in mind for a literature review are, what is already known about my topic? What theoretical lenses have already been applied or are relevant to this topic? What data have other studies found, that might be relevant? Is there a hole in the scholarship that you can help fill? Something that, hasn't been researched, some aspect of this? Do you find fault with the work of previous authors? Maybe they're too narrow in their thinking, or you think they're misinterpreting something like that. So I think the crucial part that I want to emphasize here is, this last part, right? What I see a lot of students doing is they simply take what they have read and researched at face value, but they don't go the extra step of bringing some critical analysis. By critical, I don't just mean, finding the bad parts, finding the mistakes. I mean, thinking, is this correct? Do I agree with this? Is there something that could have been done better? But I think that's a really important part of the literature review. You're not just talking about what you have read. You're also noticing patterns. Maybe that will help you group your sources as well. And you're thinking, what have other people not done, right? So to go to the example of the student thesis that we're looking at about environmental justice in Portland, probably a lot of people have studied this broad theme of the relationship between racial discrimination and environmental problems. This is a pretty well-researched topic, but probably no one or a few people have applied it to this one specific neighborhood, the history of that place in the writer's town. So I think it's important to, as you're writing your literature review or as you're editing your literature review, think about where your research fits into the body of existing scholarship, how it is building on that. Okay, some key phrases to look at here would be things like, other scholars have argued, previous research has found, several or many studies have examined some theme, and then, more critical ones looking at things that are missing. However, these studies fail to, consider something. One area that has not been studied is relatively little is known about something. Something is understudied or poorly studied. And then, as I was mentioning earlier, building upon this earlier scholarship, I wish to, investigate something. All right. So at this point, another key skill that that I wanted to bring up is embedding quotes. So this is not a grammar point, but it is a writing skill that I think will go a long way towards making your writing feel smoother, towards making your writing less clunky when you use quotes, and in general, towards making your thesis seem more sophisticated. So what is embedding quotes? Embedding quotes is the process of integrating parts of a quote with your own words in order to smooth the transition between your own words and those of another author. You still use proper citation, but instead of having, your paragraph and then a big block of someone else's words, and then you're writing again, and then a big block of someone else's words, you pick and choose only the most important phrases, sometimes even a single word, or part of a sentence from the quoted material, and you weave that in, you integrate that into your own sentences. So here's an example, not an academic example, but so suppose your professor gives you some feedback. They say, this essay was well written, although next time, please avoid the use of cliches. Okay, that's a piece of feedback, great. Let's put that into a sentence of our own, summarize that information or paraphrase that information, and embed some quotes. So that would be something like, my professor, right, I'm speaking now, told me that my essay was, quote, well written, right? That's a quote from what the professor said, and now I'm going back to my own writing. But that I should, and then I'm quoting again, avoid the use of cliches. So here, I didn't have to use this whole sentence. I just picked the parts that were most important, and I used those quotes. And I think you might also notice that the rhythm of a sentence like this is smoother than just saying something like, my professor gave me feedback. Quote, this essay was well written, although next time please avoid the use of cliches. Here it's smoother, it's nicer, and it's going to make you sound like a more sophisticated writer. Okay, so let's go back to the student thesis that we were talking about and see some parts of their literature review. Okay, so one quote that I highlighted is, my thesis builds upon Stroud's work, some researcher, using an environmental justice lens to tease out the social and political processes that have allowed for the creation and continued existence of the multitude of environmental injustices that Albania faces, right? So the part that I want to really point out here is that this student very clearly sort of uses what they have read as a jumping off point, right? My thesis builds upon this other work. And so the reader can very clearly see the relationship between this new piece of writing and the existing scholarship on the topic of environmental justice. Okay, so another quote that I wanted to pull out, the majority of environmental justice scholarship focuses exclusively on race, which is the strongest predictor of environmental hazards. Environmental justice must engage in the intersectionality between race, class, gender, and geography. Okay, so the first sentence is a bit critical of a lot of scholarship, saying it's too narrow. It only focuses on one factor, only on race. But research must, and the implication is, this research will be broader and look at how race is connected to all of these other factors. Okay, so here's another good example of how this student is positioning their own research related to past scholars' work, and also, showing that they have a broad understanding of the history of the scholarship that has been done on this particular issue. Okay, so let's move on to the methodology section. So this is, relevant to students who are doing social science or hard science research. That's relevant to humanities research. But in any case, some questions that you might ask here would be, what is your research design? How did you collect your data? And how did you analyze it? Maybe what programs you used, what kind of survey you created if you're using a survey, etc. What was your justification for your choices. Why didn't you choose another method? Why did you think that the one that you chose was the most suitable, the best one to use? And are there any shortcomings to your methodological approach? Are there any flaws in your research design that you should acknowledge, right? So, maybe there's something that you can't help that might create some skewing that you should acknowledge at the beginning. Okay, so key phrases to think about here would be things like this study used or utilized something, some design, for example. The study asked participants about something, if this is interviews or surveys. The goal of the interviews was to something, to recruit participants. I did something. Some kind of method was used in order to, establish something. Something are over or underrepresented in the sample, maybe a particular age group, a particular major, a particular ethnic identity, whatever. One limitation of this method is blah, blah, blah. All right, so let's look at examples from the thesis that we're examining. So as I mentioned, this is a history thesis, so it doesn't have a discrete methodology section per se, but the student does clearly establish the kinds of sources they look at. So let's look at those sentences. Through applying a lens of environmental justice to city planning documents, housing and segregation policies, census data, newspaper clippings, and historical texts, this thesis analyzes the history of settlements, housing policies, segregation, in-city migration, urban renewal, and industrial development in the Alpena community of Portland, Oregon. Okay, so here the student is clearly laying out the kinds of primary documents that they analyzed in order to, find what they found. And in the next quote, I want to highlight how the student discussed a potential flaw or potential issue with some of the sources that they used. So they say, it is important to note that much of the older data from the U.S. Census, which is part of what they're using for their research, as well as other early government documents, do not always differentiate between white and non-white Hispanics. So here, they're studying race, but they want to note for the reader that in the history of U.S. Census documents, there's some inconsistency in how the census asks about race that might make it a bit difficult to draw certain conclusions or to know certain things because they did or did not collect information on a particular question at different times, right? So this is something that is not the students' fault, right? They can't control the census in the 1950s, but they're just noting it because it does have implications for what they can know in the present and what conclusions they can draw potentially. Okay, so the discussion section where you're going to be actually discussing your results. So what is the significance of your data? Do they challenge previously held beliefs or earlier findings? Maybe they contradict, some common assumptions in the field. How do you explain your findings? Are alternative explanations possible? And why do you reject these alternative explanations? Okay, so some key phrases for this section might be, these results indicate something, these data are consistent with something, analysis of the results revealed something, from these results we can conclude that something, and one possible explanation for these data is something. Okay, so because the student didn't have like a quantitative research design, for example, a history thesis is going to be structured a bit differently, but just to look at some of the data that they found, historical data, we can look at things like anti-Chinese sentiment remained, Portlanders largely favored the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and residents passed a resolution in favor of the act, right? So this is an example of racism against Chinese people that the student found, right? They're studying the history of racism in Portland and how that impacted environmental justice. So this is one piece of data, a historical piece of data. And then another one, the resulting housing shortage coupled with severe economic decline culminated in a resurgence of racist policies that made it difficult for Black and Asian Americans to rent apartments in houses. Okay, so another piece of historical data, clearly stated, and the reader can clearly see or imagine the implications for the topic that this is writing about. Okay, so let's move on to the conclusion. So I'm sure that you guys have written conclusions for essays many times in your life, but things that you might think about here are, what are the real world implications of your findings? Going back to the question of why this is important. And then lastly, what could future research add? So some phrases to think about here would be, this study has implications for, ... Further research is needed in order to, ... And future studies might look at, ... Okay, so the student thesis, returning to that again, the student writes, the shortcomings of Portland's growth must be recognized in order to work towards facilitating just change. Environmental inequality is not just an issue found in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York, big cities, but it can be found everywhere, even in the heart of the places that we imagine are doing things right. So I think this is a great couple of sentences in terms of establishing why this research is important, right? So as we discussed earlier, and as the students established in their introduction, many people consider Portland to be a great place in terms of their environmental policy, but as the student's essay looked at, not only are there some pollution problems, but these pollution problems tend to affect minorities the most, right? And so the student is saying that if a city, any city, wants to grow in a just way, a fair way that doesn't impact, minority groups more than majority groups, then they have to consider things like how the history of racism might impact environmental policy. Okay, so let's suppose you're working on your draft and you get stuck. So a couple of suggestions if that happens. The first is to know that you don't have to write from beginning to end. Sometimes students get stuck, for example, because they don't know how to write their introduction. And so that's sort of stopping them. Or they're writing a particular chapter and they just get stuck. They don't know what sentence to use next, or they just simply don't know what to put next. So one thing that I have found helpful in my own writing is not to write from the beginning of the end, right? So if I'm stuck on the methodology chapter, for instance, well, I might go back to the literature review section and work on that, or go to the discussion section and work on that, right? You don't have to write from the beginning to end. And also, a lot of people actually write the introduction last because it's easiest to write once you sort of have the overall scope of the project in your head. So writing out of order can be quite helpful. If you're just not in a writing mood, maybe there's another type of task you could be working on. So maybe you're just stuck in terms of writing, but you could be doing other things, such as finding images, creating graphs, writing your acknowledgement section, working on the formatting, just researching, these kinds of things, right? That's also contributing to your project, but just not in a, in terms of adding sentence upon sentence. Of course, can you meet with your advisor? Maybe they can help you. And can your peers help? Maybe someone in your senior thesis seminar can give you some advice. Maybe they had the same problem and they overcame it. So I encourage you to reach out to your peers for advice. And then lastly, some further resources. There are examples of old senior theses, both stored at the library and online at the library's site. So you can go to this link. Let me put it in the chat actually, so that it's easier to access. Well, I'll put it in the chat after I've done screen sharing. You can go to this link and look at senior theses from various departments across the years, and it might be useful, in terms of things like formatting. So maybe you have a question about, basic question about formatting. You don't want to bother your advisor with it. You think it's too small. You can look at old senior theses and see how they did it, and that might be helpful to you. I also want to highlight the resources for students page on the WARC's website. So if you go to warc, warc.uca.kg, and you scroll down, you'll see a resources for students page. That has a lot of resources, as the name suggests, on writing in general, but also specifically a lot of advice for senior thesis writers and examples of senior theses. So that might be helpful to you as well. And lastly, of course, I have to plug the WARC. Of course, you're welcome to come to the WARC for writing help or English help, if that's the problem you're having with your writing at any stage, right? Even if you haven't written a word of your essay or your thesis, although I'm sure all of you have written at least one word by now, you're welcome to come. They can help you plan the chapter. They can help you with research skills. They can help you, build confidence in your writing, brainstorm, really any part of the process. So I encourage you to book a session sooner rather than later, because close to the deadlines or close to exams, as many of you may not know, the sessions do get booked up very quickly. So with that, I'm going to turn off screen sharing. I will put the link that I was mentioning earlier to past AUCA senior theses in the chat for you guys to look at. And I will open it up to questions and answers. Okay, so I see a couple of, one question in the chat related to, could you send this presentation here for revising? Yes, so as mentioned before, this session is being recorded and we will post it to our YouTube page, and we'll post when that happens on our Facebook page. So you can follow us on Facebook or just check our page for that announcement. Oh, and Maria has very helpfully posted our YouTube channel here. So for those of you who might have missed the link earlier, this is where we have posted all of our past lectures or discussions about academic writing, and it's where we'll post this one as well. So I had a question here from a student in the private chat. So what is discourse analysis, and what are some good methods to gather data? So I'm not quite sure what you mean by discourse analysis. Any idea of an idea of what that means, discourse analysis?
Yes, it is, from what I understand, it is the analysis of the use of language, right? How language is used, to express, for instance, to express power or, subjugate someone, for instance, right? Things.
Oh, yeah,
things.
I see.
Discourse analysis, yes.
Sure. And the student also asked, what are some good methods to gather data? So that's quite a broad question, and I think it really depends on what you're researching, right? A biologist is going to gather data in a very different way from an economist, for instance. So I think if you have questions like this, it might be more helpful to book a session with a work tutor in your particular area. So for instance, if you're an economics student, book a session with them. They're going to be able to have much more specific answers than I could give, just because I don't know what your area is, and it might not be my area of expertise. Probably isn't, frankly.
And also, perhaps, this is a question that, that can be directed to your advisor, or to the professor teaching your senior thesis seminar, because if it is something that is part of your field, then it is something that definitely the experts will be able to help you out with.
Sure, that's a great point as well. Okay, so I have a student in the chat asking about the results section. Okay, so if, for example, you're doing a survey or you're doing some quantitative analysis, you usually have a results section and then a discussion. So in the results section, you sort of neutrally state what you found. 50% of people said this, 20% of people said that. And then in the discussion section, you do your interpretation, drawing conclusions, noticing some trends, for example. So I think the key distinction between these is that the results, you're just sort of giving the data in like paragraph form, basically, with charts as well, if need be. Whereas the discussion section, you're actually going to be doing some interpretation. Okay, so one student says, if I'm only working with books and online sources, can it be called a quantitative method? So I guess it really depends on what you're doing. So for example, there are people who apply quantitative methods to literature where they look at the frequency of certain words in a book, right? That's a quantitative approach to just a book. The distinction between quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis is, in quantitative analysis, you're asking, questions like how many, right? What percentage, right? Whereas in qualitative analysis, you're looking at things like how do people feel about this? What is the history of this? So it's more, I would say, about the kinds of questions that you're asking, and of course that will lead into the methodology. But I think theoretically you could use a quantitative or a qualitative approach to answer a lot of different, or to look at a lot of different topics, as well as to examine a lot of different resources. Would you have anything to add there, Maria?
No, I think you pretty much got it all. I just wanted to give you an example using a paper that I wrote a few years ago. So I had, I was writing a paper actually about the work, right? And I was asking some qualitative, and I was also asking some quantitative questions as well, right? For instance, the quantitative part, I wanted to know that, people that come to the work 10 times or more per semester, what's their average GPA what's their GPA compared to the university average? Or I wanted to know what the retention among that group is, right? And the answer was actually that GPA tends to be higher, and also retention among people that come to the work is significantly higher, 9% more than university average, right? So that was just, or I wanted to know whether the grades in the courses, in the tutored courses, are higher than the grades, grades of students that don't come to the work, right? It was purely, kind of a quantitative thing, right? But also I was conducting interviews, and I was asking what it is that people found helpful or not helpful, and so on. So that is, but for example, if I wanted, but another thing that I did is I transcribed all the interviews, and I wanted to know how many times the word stress was mentioned by people who talked about their university experience and the role of the work. And then it was like, and I think 10%, I think that, not 10? Yeah, like 20% of the time, right? The word stress was mentioned. So that was obviously the qualitative approach to something that is, to something that is essentially a quantitative enterprise, which is interview. So you can, so it's not like one or the other. You don't necessarily need to answer your question. It basically depends on what you're trying to do, right? For example, you're asking if you can use online sources. For example, if the results of the census are online, and you want to know what percentage of the population was engaged in whatever activity, right? Then you can absolutely ask ask a quantitative question. I'm sorry, a qualitative question, and vice versa. So it doesn't so much depend on the materials that you use, it more depends on the questions that you ask and on your research methods. Does that answer the question?
I think so. She wrote thank you in the chat, so hopefully, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I hope that was clear for everybody. Any other questions? You can put them in the chat, or you can press the hand raise button.
Can I just try to say
Yeah,
something?
go ahead.
I mean, we are having the senior thesis seminars 1, so where we kind of get quite thorough introduction to how does the thesis writing goes. And one of the nice parts is that it's around 30 to 40 pages for the undergraduate students, right? So which is pretty much just twice bigger than the second year seminar papers. But so and the reference requirements are not that high. My question is that no, not a question, probably comment to the research that that you have conducted. Is that a support throughout the thesis writing is very critical, because I have never written a thesis, but I have written a second year seminar, and these consultations that you can have via office hours or that kind of things are really very critical, and the ability for your professor to proofread, I think. So thank you for the work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, to comment, to respond to this comment, I absolutely agree with you that that it's a major undertaking. That senior thesis is, it's a lot of work, and of course, support is very important. The one thing is, however, I would like to mention is that proofreading is definitely not something that most professor will or really should do, right? That is not your job. I mean, you are as your advisors, their main concern is with the quality of your research, is to make sure that that there are no holes in your research question, right? That your research question is properly focused and unbiased and so on, that you are using the right methodological tools to to answer your research question, that you're looking in the right place, that your data is that your data is straight, and that you're interpreting that you have the literature that came before you, and that that you are capable of interpreting your findings. That is really where their concern is, right? With that, sort of with the intellectual quality of your thesis, right? The English language is not really, not really their issue. I mean, they're not English teachers, they're not proofreaders, but they are specialists in that field, the field to which you are now adding, right? To which you are now contributing with your research, right? So, and they have to look at the quality of your contribution. That is where, that support is really crucial.
Do we have any other questions from people in the audience? A student wrote in the chat, how can we know that our thesis topic is good? So I would advise you to look at the video that we have done and posted on YouTube. The YouTube link is in the chat about how to write a research proposal, because that video has at the beginning quite a detailed discussion of what a research question is and what a good research question is. So I think that reviewing that will be very helpful. In terms of how do we know that our thesis topic is good? So I think one thing that I want to point out here is that you're phrasing it as a topic, but it might be more useful to phrase it as a research question, which is why I alluded to that discussion. Just because, you know, if the topic is pollution, like the thesis that we were looking at in the presentation, well, there could be so many research questions related to that, right? You can look at pollution's effect on economics and say, like, how does you know, let's look at Bishkek. How does Bishkek's smog problem affect whether people decide to buy homes or where they buy their homes, right? That's an economic decision. Or you can look at it from a medical point of view, look at the effects on people's lungs, right? How does Bishkek's pollution affect people's lungs? Or you can look at it from a sociological point of view, right? How does Bishkek's pollution affect how people think of their home, for example? Right? So there are so many different questions that you can ask from this one topic, you know, pollution, that I think it's much more useful to think of it in terms of a research question. In terms of whether it's good or not, besides looking at the video that I suggested, the lecture that I suggested, I think it might also be helpful just to talk to your advisor. I'm sure that they have input on this matter. They have studied this field, and they will surely have, you know, some understanding of what research has already been done on this, you know, general subject, and hopefully how your topic, how your particular research, excuse me, is adding to that discussion. Maria, do you have anything to add at this point?
No, I think you got it.
Okay, great. Any other questions? If not, I would just like to say thank you to everyone for attending. I hope it was helpful. I hope it was clear. As I mentioned before, we will be posting the recording within a couple of hours onto our YouTube page. We also post the slides on our website under the resources for students section. So if you prefer that, just to see the slides, you're welcome to do so. Other than that, I guess we'll just wrap up here. So I hope that all of you have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.